Welcome to Eerie Stories to Relax. Before we dive in, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the stories. This happened when I was a teenager, living in a quiet neighborhood. It was just another day like any other, and I was home alone after school. I was hanging out in my room, probably scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something odd. A car had been parked in front of our house for a few hours. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for people to park on our street. But as the hours went on, it started to bug me. The car just sat there, unmoving, like whoever was inside wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, I went outside to grab the newspaper, and I realized something strange. My neighbors, who I'd spoken to just the day before, weren't outside. Normally, I'd see them getting ready for work or hanging out in their yard. But that morning, nothing. I thought maybe they had just gone out early or were away for the day, so I didn't think much of it at the time. But as the week went on, things took an even stranger turn. That same car I had noticed parked outside our house earlier in the week appeared again. This time, the owner of the car, an older man I didn't recognize, was walking toward a wooded area not too far from our neighborhood. It wasn't unusual for people to walk there, but something about the way he moved, like he had a specific destination in mind, gave me an uneasy feeling. A few days later, police started showing up in the neighborhood, asking around if anyone had seen anything unusual. I didn't think I could be of any help, but then I overheard them talking to my parents. They were asking if we had noticed anything out of the ordinary. It turned out that my neighbors had gone missing. They hadn't been seen or heard from in days, and no one knew where they had gone. That's when it hit me. I remembered seeing that car parked outside our house, and the man walking toward the woods. It all connected in a way I couldn't ignore. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew I had to tell the police what I had seen. When the officers came by to ask more questions, I told them about the car and the man who had walked toward the woods. I mentioned that I had seen him a couple of times, and that he seemed to be watching the house. They didn't say much at the time, but I could tell they were taking it seriously. As the investigation unfolded, I found out that my neighbor's disappearance was linked to some unsettling circumstances. The man I had seen walking toward the woods had apparently been connected to their disappearance in some way. They didn't go into specifics, but I later learned that the investigation had turned into something far more serious than I had initially thought. I'm not sure how much I contributed to the case, but after that, I never looked at our quiet suburban neighborhood the same way again. That strange car and the man who kept walking into the woods stayed on my mind long after the police left. I'll never forget how something that seemed so normal at first turned into something terrifying. And to this day, I still wonder if I saw something that could have helped prevent whatever happened to my neighbors. When I moved into my new house, I was beyond excited. It was my first time living alone, and I couldn't wait to make the place my own. It was an older house, the kind with creaky floors and lots of character, as the real estate agent put it. At first, the little noises, pops in the walls, creaks in the floorboards, didn't bother me. It just felt like the house settling, you know. But after a few weeks, I started noticing weird stuff. For one, I kept hearing noises late at night coming from the basement. It sounded like faint shuffling or the clink of something metallic. I'd try to convince myself it was the old pipes or maybe just animals outside. But the thing that really got me, I'd wake up every morning to find the basement door slightly open. At first, I thought I was just being careless. Maybe I wasn't closing it all the way. So I made a point of locking it every night before bed. But even locked, it would still be open in the morning. That's when I started to feel like something was seriously off. One night, I decided to set up a camera to figure out what was going on. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old webcam I propped up to face the basement door. I went to bed feeling half ridiculous, half terrified. I didn't sleep much that night, and when I woke up, the door was ajar again, just like before. When I checked the footage the next morning, my heart stopped. Around 2 a.m., the door slowly creaked open. A man, a stranger, emerged from the basement. He was thin, wearing dirty clothes, and he moved so quietly, it was almost eerie. He had a flashlight and seemed to know exactly where he was going. The worst part? He went straight to my pantry, took a few cans of food, and then disappeared back down the basement stairs like it was the most normal thing in the world. I called the police immediately. They came out and searched the basement, but by the time they arrived, the guy was gone. They found signs that someone had been living down there. Old blankets, a makeshift bed, and a pile of trash. He'd been coming and going through a broken basement window I hadn't even noticed. The cops told me I was lucky the guy hadn't done anything worse, but that didn't make me feel any better. They never caught him, and I couldn't stop wondering how long he'd been there. Had he been sneaking around before I moved in, watching me while I slept? Needless to say, I didn't stay in that house much longer. Even after fixing the window and changing the locks, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. Every little creak or shuffle made me jump. I don't think I'll ever forget that footage. The way he moved so casually, like he owned the place. It's something straight out of a nightmare. This happened when I was around 16, and I'll never forget how it felt. One summer afternoon, I was hanging out at home when I heard some strange noises coming from the backyard. It sounded like something, or someone, was messing around near the shed. At first, I figured it was just an animal or maybe the wind. But after a while, I got this weird feeling in my gut. It didn't sound right. I decided to go check it out, just to be sure. The shed was at the far end of the yard, tucked behind some trees, so I didn't always go back there unless I needed something. As I walked over, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My first thought was that maybe one of the animals had gotten in, or maybe my dad had left it open. But as I got closer, something didn't feel right. I pushed the door open a little wider, and to my absolute shock, there was a man inside. He was crouched down, holding a crowbar in his hands, and just staring at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I froze, completely paralyzed by fear. My brain couldn't process what was happening. He stared right at me, and then, with the strangest calmness, he asked if I could help him with something. His tone was casual, like we were talking about the weather or something normal. But my heart was racing, and my entire body was telling me to get the hell out of there. I don't know what made me snap out of it, but I suddenly turned and ran as fast as I could back to the house. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and called my dad immediately. I was shaking the whole time, trying to explain what had just happened. My dad didn't hesitate. He told me to stay inside, and he rushed home from work. By the time my dad arrived, the man was gone. We went outside, and it was clear that someone had been inside the shed. Things were out of place. Tools scattered around, boxes rifled through, and the lock on the shed had been tampered with. It was obvious someone had been looking for something. My dad called the police, and they came to check it out. But by then, the man was long gone. Later, we found out that a few other homes in the neighborhood had been burglarized in a similar manner. The police said it looked like the guy had been casing houses, probably targeting ones where people were home alone or just not paying attention. The weirdest part was that no one had noticed him before, even though he'd been moving through backyards and, apparently, getting into sheds like ours. It took me a long time to feel comfortable going into that backyard again. I always looked over my shoulder, and I never went near the shed without making sure everything was locked up tight. The whole experience left me feeling shaken, and I couldn't shake the image of that man just calmly looking at me as if I was supposed to help him. Looking back, I'm grateful I listened to that gut feeling that something was off. I shudder to think about what might have happened if I hadn't run inside to call my dad. The whole situation was bizarre, and even though the man was never caught, I've never felt quite the same walking around that yard. This happened a few years ago, and it still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was living on a quiet street in a suburban neighborhood where everything was routine and uneventful. But every so often I'd see a man walking around late at night. At first I figured he was just another random guy, maybe out for a late walk or doing something harmless. But after a while, his presence started to feel wrong, like something wasn't quite right. He wore a reflective vest, like something you'd see a construction worker wear, and he was always carrying a bucket and a few cleaning supplies. The strange part? He didn't seem to be doing anything normal. He'd stop at street signs and lampposts, wipe them down, and then move on. It was always well past midnight when he'd be out there. I never understood what he was cleaning, and it definitely wasn't just a one-time thing. It became a pattern. The more I saw him, the more it freaked me out. I'd hear him out there scraping something or wiping down the metal signs in the street. At first, I tried to brush it off, but I started getting this weird feeling that something wasn't right. Why was this guy out there doing this so late at night, every night? One evening, I decided to stay up and watch from my bedroom window, just to see what he was really doing. I was nervous, but my curiosity got the best of me. I kept an eye on him, trying to make out what he was doing. After a while, I saw him stop in front of my house right on the sidewalk. He stood still for a minute, just staring at my house. I froze. I couldn't tell if he was looking directly at me or just staring at the house in general, but it was enough to make my heart start racing. He stood there for a good 5 minutes before he turned and started walking down the street again. I quickly pulled away from the window and sat in the dark, hoping he hadn't seen me. The next morning I went outside to check the mailbox, and that's when I noticed something really strange. My mailbox, perfectly normal the night before, was now completely scrubbed clean, as if someone had gone over it with a rag for hours. The real kicker, though, was that the house number, which had always been on the mailbox, was now crudely scratched into the door of my house. I felt like my blood ran cold. It didn't make any sense. Who would do something like that? Why would he be cleaning everything? And why go so far as to scratch the number into my door? I started to feel like I was being watched every night, even though I never saw the man again after that. I never told anyone about it because I was worried they'd think I was overreacting. But I stopped staying up late to watch for him. I didn't want to know what he might be doing next. I moved out a couple of years later, and I never saw that man again. But to this day, I still wonder who he was and what his intentions were. This happened a couple of years ago when I was still living in my first apartment. It was a small place, nothing fancy, but I loved having my own space. One evening, I was home alone, just chilling after work, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but I didn't think much of it. I answered, expecting maybe a wrong number or a telemarketer. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. Then I heard this faint sound, almost like breathing. I said hello again, thinking maybe it was a bad connection, but the breathing continued. It wasn't just random breathing either. It was slow and deliberate, like they were matching my own. I felt a little creeped out, but didn't want to overreact. I brushed it off and hung up. But not even 5 minutes later, the same number called again. This time, I didn't say anything right away. I just listened. After a few seconds, I heard tapping, like someone drumming their fingers on a surface. It took me a moment to realize it sounded exactly like what I had just been doing on my countertop. That's when the chill hit me. I'd been idly tapping my fingers on the counter without thinking about it. It was the same rhythm, the same sound. I hung up again, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. Always the same thing. Silence at first, then mimicking. One time, I dropped my keys onto the counter during a call, and the person on the other end imitated it perfectly. It was like they were watching me, even though I was locked inside my apartment with the blinds drawn. By the 4th or 5th call, I was too scared to answer. I'd see the number pop up and just let it ring. But that didn't stop the dread from creeping in every time my phone buzzed. It felt like whoever was doing this knew how to get under my skin. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I went to the police to report the calls. I didn't think they'd take it seriously at first, but as soon as I showed them the call logs and explained what had been happening, their expressions changed. They told me they'd look into it and keep me updated. A few days later, I got a call from one of the officers. They told me that a man had been arrested in the area for stalking. He'd been harassing several people, including previous tenants of my building. The officer didn't give me all the details, but apparently, he'd been known to watch people from a distance, learning their routines and calling to scare them. Knowing he'd been caught should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. I couldn't stop thinking about how he seemed to know exactly what I was doing, even when I was inside my own home. Had he been watching me somehow, listening through the walls? I moved out of that apartment not long after. I couldn't stay there, knowing someone like that had been targeting me. To this day, I'm still cautious about answering calls from unknown numbers. And every once in a while, I'll catch myself tapping my fingers on a surface or dropping my keys and get a chill, remembering those calls. This happened to me when I was in high school, and it still gives me the chills thinking about it. I was home alone one afternoon after school, just doing my usual thing, snacking, watching TV, and scrolling on my phone, when I heard a knock on the door. It was around 3:30, and I wasn't expecting anyone, so I wasn't too thrilled to get up and answer it. But after a few more knocks, I figured I should at least check it out. When I opened the door, there was a man standing there, holding a package. He looked like he was in his late 30s, wearing a generic-looking jacket and a cap, nothing that really stood out. He said he had a delivery for my parents, which sounded pretty normal at first. But I told him right away that I wasn't expecting anything. He didn't seem to care too much about that, and his attitude shifted. He insisted that he had a package for them, and it was urgent. I told him again that we weren't expecting anything, but he started acting a little pushy. He even tried to peer inside the house through the window beside the door, and that's when I started feeling weird. I politely said I couldn't accept the package, and that's when his behavior really made me nervous. Instead of leaving, he just stood there for a few seconds, like he was weighing something in his head. I stepped back from the door and was about to close it when he pushed a little harder, trying to talk me into taking the package. He mumbled something about needing my parents' signature, but I knew something wasn't right. At that point, I felt a mix of confusion and panic. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, and retreated to my bedroom. I was freaking out a little, but I tried to calm myself down. I just couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I waited for a few minutes, hoping he would leave. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps circling around the house. I wasn't sure if it was him, but it definitely wasn't just the wind. I stayed in my room, heart pounding, praying he would just leave. After a while, the footsteps stopped, and I didn't hear anything else. I waited another few minutes before I cautiously went to the window and peeked outside. That's when I saw something odd. There was a small unmarked box sitting on the porch, right by the door. No delivery slip, no address, just a plain box. I didn't know what to think, but I definitely wasn't going to open it. When my parents got home later that evening, I told them what had happened. They were both concerned, but they didn't take it too seriously at first. That is, until they checked with the delivery service, and no package had been ordered for our address. They confirmed there was no record of a delivery, and no tracking info matched what the man had claimed. We ended up calling the police just to report the strange interaction, but they didn't find anything out of the ordinary when they came by. The box, by the way, was just a small empty package. No return address, no markings, nothing. I don't know what that guy's intentions were, but I'm grateful nothing worse happened. It was such a weird, unsettling experience. I'm still not sure why he was so insistent or what he was really looking for. After that day, I made sure to never open the door to anyone unless I was expecting them. It's been a while since then, but every time I think back to that moment, I remember how quickly everything went from normal to feeling completely wrong. I still wonder what might have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts to lock the door and stay inside. When I was a kid, I used to visit a family friend, Mr. Jim, every summer. He lived way out in the middle of nowhere in rural Tennessee. His house was surrounded by woods, the kind that seemed to go on forever, and there wasn't much around except fields, old dirt roads, and a few scattered neighbors miles apart. One of the best parts of those visits was spending time with Mr. Jim's son, Mike. He was older than me, but not by much, just enough to feel like the cool older friend who showed me how to do all kinds of outdoorsy stuff. Mike taught me how to shoot a BB gun, took me fishing, and made me feel like I was part of the crew. One summer, he invited me to go hunting with him for rabbits and wild turkeys. I was thrilled. We started early in the morning, hiking deep into the woods. I carried a small BB gun, while Mike had his rifle. I remember feeling so grown up, trekking alongside him through the trees, listening for movement, and learning how to track animals. It was peaceful at first, the kind of quiet you only find in places far from people. After a couple of hours without much luck, we decided to push further into the woods than we usually went. That's when we stumbled upon something strange. There, in a small clearing, was a broken gravestone. It looked ancient, covered in moss and cracks, leaning awkwardly against a tree. At first, we thought it was kind of cool. Mike stepped closer to take a look, and I followed. The inscription was faded, but we could still make out some of the words. It had a name, a date from the 1800s, and then something that sent a chill down my spine. It said something about serving the devil or being bound to him forever. I don't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something along those lines. Mike stared at it for a moment, not saying a word. Then, out of nowhere, the wind picked up. Hard. The leaves around us started swirling in circles, like some kind of mini tornado had formed right in the clearing. It wasn't like a regular breeze. This was intense and sudden, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The trees creaked and swayed, and the sound of the wind was deafening. Mike turned to me, his face pale, and grabbed my arm. "We're going," he said, his voice sharp and urgent. We didn't run, but we moved fast, weaving through the trees as the wind seemed to follow us. He kept his rifle ready, scanning the woods like he expected something or someone to jump out at us. My heart was pounding the whole time. I couldn't stop thinking about the gravestone and the words on it. By the time we got back to Mr. Jim's house, the wind had died down, but the tension hadn't. Mike didn't say a word about what happened, and I was too scared to ask. He just cleaned his rifle, told me to go inside, and acted like everything was normal. We never went back to that part of the woods again, and the incident was never mentioned. Even now, as an adult, I still think about it. What was up with that gravestone? Why did the wind go crazy like that? I don't know if it was something supernatural or just one hell of a coincidence, but it scared the hell out of me. To this day, whenever I visit that area, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are watching me. And I've never gone hunting again. This happened a couple of weeks ago, and honestly, I'm still trying to process it. I've always loved going to the shopping center near my house. It's my little escape, a place to browse, grab a coffee, and unwind. But now, I can't even think about going back without feeling sick to my stomach. I was walking through the mall when a man I didn't recognize came up to me out of nowhere. At first, I thought he was just trying to ask for directions or something, but his tone and body language felt off. He started with casual small talk, asking if I was married, and I immediately told him I was. I even showed him my wedding ring, hoping it would be enough to make him back off. It wasn't. Instead, he kept pushing, saying things like, "Your husband doesn't have to know," and asking for my number. I was firm and told him I wasn't interested, but he just smirked and followed me as I tried to walk away. It was so uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I moved into a different store, thinking he'd get bored and leave. He didn't. A few minutes later, as I was leaving the store, I saw him waiting for me. My gut was screaming that something was off. Thankfully, I'd set up a code word with one of my friends for emergencies, and I quickly pulled out my phone to text her. She responded immediately, saying she was on her way and to hang tight. That's when he came closer and his tone shifted, angrier now, like he was offended that I hadn't given him what he wanted. He got right in my face, demanding to know why I was being such a bitch. I stayed calm, repeating that I wasn't interested in trying to step around him, but then he grabbed my arm. Hard. I froze for a second, panic flooding my system. Then he yanked at my hair, pulling me closer, and that's when I knew this was more than just harassment. Those next few minutes felt like hours. I tried to pull away, telling the guy to let go, but he just tightened his grip, calling me all sorts of disgusting names. People around us were staring, but no one stepped in, which made it even more terrifying. I kept thinking, what if nobody helps? What if he drags me out of here? Just as things were escalating, my friend showed up. She's not a big person, but she's fiery as hell and doesn't take crap from anyone. She walked straight up to us and shoved the guy back, putting herself between him and me. She yelled at him, loud enough to draw real attention, and when he tried to argue, she didn't hesitate to push him again, harder this time. I don't know if it was the scene she caused or the fact that she wasn't afraid to get physical, but he finally backed off, muttering under his breath before walking away. My friend hugged me tight and walked me to my car, making sure I was okay before driving me home. That night, I couldn't stop shaking. The whole thing brought back memories of something similar that happened to me years ago, and I couldn't help but think about how much worse this could have been if my friend hadn't shown up. The what-ifs have been haunting me ever since. I've reported the incident to mall security and the police, but honestly, I'm not holding my breath that anything will come of it. All I can do now is be grateful for my friend and try to work through the fear and trauma this has left behind. To anyone reading this, trust your gut and never hesitate to ask for help. You're not overreacting and you're not being dramatic. Sometimes, just having one person who's willing to stand up for you can make all the difference. Last year, I decided to dip my toes back into online dating. After some harmless chatting with a guy I met on Facebook, we agreed to meet for coffee. The date was fine. Nothing spectacular, nothing awful. We talked about the usual stuff: work, hobbies, travel. It ended with a polite goodbye, and I didn't feel any spark, so I figured that was that. A week later, though, something happened that still makes my stomach churn. I was home on a quiet evening when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I peeked out the window to see who it was. It was him, the guy from the coffee date. At first, I thought maybe it was some weird coincidence. Maybe he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd stop by. But when I cautiously opened the door just a crack, his casual tone sent shivers down my spine. He said something like, "I figured I'd swing by since you didn't call me back." I hadn't told him where I lived. Trying to stay calm, I asked how he found my house. He smiled and shrugged, like it was no big deal, saying, "Oh, you mentioned a coffee shop nearby and I just pieced it together." That's when the fear really kicked in. He'd tracked me down. I told him firmly that he shouldn't be there, and that I wasn't comfortable with him showing up uninvited. But he didn't budge. He just kept knocking and asking to come in, his tone way too casual for what he was doing. I shut the door, locked it, and called the police. While I waited for them to arrive, he kept knocking and pacing around my porch like it was the most normal thing in the world. It felt like hours before I finally saw the flashing lights. As soon as he spotted the cops, he bolted, disappearing into the night. I thought that would be the end of it. But a few days later, I found something on my porch that made me realize just how far this guy was willing to go. It was a photo of me, taken from outside my house. In the picture, I was standing by the window, drinking coffee. Scrawled across the back of the photo was the message, "Why don't you invite me?" I couldn't breathe. He'd been watching me, maybe even while I was obliviously going about my day inside my home. That was the final straw. I didn't feel safe there anymore. Within a few weeks, I put my house up for sale and moved to a different area. The process of packing and relocating was exhausting. but I couldn't stay in a place where I felt like a sitting target. Since then, I've stopped using online dating apps completely. I've become paranoid about what I share, even in casual conversations. The whole experience left me shaken to my core, questioning how much we unknowingly give away about ourselves. Looking back, I wish I'd been more cautious about what I said and how much personal information I shared. But I never imagined someone could take things this far. It's terrifying to realize how little control you have once someone decides to cross those boundaries. A few months ago, my friend and I went to an exhibition that was being held near a local mall. It was a fun day, walking around, checking out the different exhibits, and just enjoying the atmosphere. But things took a turn when the mall started closing down for the night. As we were leaving, we noticed two men dressed in all black. They were walking a little too closely behind us, and something about their presence felt off. We'd been enjoying the evening, but now I could feel the tension creeping in. My friend, who has always had a keen sense for things like this, immediately grabbed my arm and whispered that we should get out of the area. Without a second thought, she dragged me into a nearby store, of all places. It's usually a store aimed at younger crowds, selling jewelry and accessories. But that night, it was a safe place. We stood there for a few minutes, trying to act casual while peeking through the store window. The two men had stopped outside, pacing for a moment, then disappeared. We couldn't see them anymore. They had likely noticed us ducking into the store and decided to slip away before we could spot them again. Looking back, I'm so thankful for my friend's quick thinking. If she hadn't acted so fast, we might not have had the chance to get away unnoticed. That whole experience made me realize just how much can happen when you're not paying attention, especially in public places at night. Since then, I've made sure to stay more aware of my surroundings, especially when I'm out late. It only takes one moment of carelessness for things to go south. I'll always credit my friend for possibly preventing something dangerous that night. I still get chills thinking about this. It was my junior year of high school, and I was walking home after staying late for a group project. Normally, I'd stick to the main roads, but I was tired and wanted to get home fast, so I decided to take a shortcut through this wooded area near my neighborhood. It wasn't super dense or anything, more like a path through some overgrown brush, but it was quiet, with no one else around. About halfway through, I noticed a car parked just off the path, partially hidden by the trees. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind that didn't seem like it belonged there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone broke down or something. But then I saw him. There was a guy leaning against the car, smoking a cigarette. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there and staring straight at me. I remember how heavy his gaze felt, like he was sizing me up or something. I tried to act like I didn't notice and kept walking, my heart pounding. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time until I was out of the woods. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I mean, it's not like he did anything, right? Just a random guy in the woods, weird, but not illegal. But then, as I was walking out of school, I saw the same car. This time, it was parked much closer, across the street from the school's main entrance. He was sitting inside, leaning forward like he was watching the students. My stomach dropped when I recognized him. The same guy from the woods. He didn't even try to hide. He just sat there, like he was waiting for something. The next day, I told my friend about it, half expecting them to brush it off, but their face went pale. They said they'd heard rumors about a car like that, and someone matching his description. Apparently, a few kids had seen him driving slowly around the neighborhood, following them as they walked home. Worse, a girl from a nearby school had gone missing the week before. At that point, I didn't know what to do. I was too freaked out to walk home, so I stayed at school until my mom could pick me up. On the way home, I told her everything, and she called the police to report it. The cops came by our house later to ask questions, and I gave them as much detail as I could about the car and the guy. I don't know if they ever found him, but for the next few weeks, everyone at school was on edge. Teachers started reminding us to walk in groups and avoid shortcuts, and my parents wouldn't let me walk home alone anymore. I never saw the car again after that, but the thought of what could have happened still haunts me. Knowing that someone out there was watching kids, maybe planning something, and how close I came to being one of them, it's terrifying. We were on a family road trip, and we decided to stop at this cheap roadside hotel for the night. It was one of those no-frills places with a parking lot right in front, and our room had a small balcony. Nothing special, but it was late, and I just needed some fresh air. So, I stepped out onto the balcony to stretch my legs and get a bit of air before heading to bed. As I glanced across the parking lot, I noticed a man standing by his car, staring up at me. At first, I thought he was just resting or maybe checking something on his vehicle. Nothing unusual. But after a few minutes, he stood up straight and started walking toward the hotel. My heart instantly dropped. I couldn't explain why, but something about the way he was walking made my stomach twist. It wasn't like he was just walking to the office or heading out. He was heading straight toward the building, and it was almost like he was deliberately heading my way. Panicking, I quickly rushed inside, slammed the balcony door shut, and locked it. I turned off the lights and tried to keep quiet, praying that maybe he hadn't seen me or hadn't noticed me standing there. My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation for what was happening. Minutes passed, and just as I started to calm down, I heard it. A faint sound from the front of the room. The unmistakable rattle of the door handle. Someone was testing the door. My pulse skyrocketed. I couldn't tell if it was the man from the parking lot or just some coincidence, but it didn't matter. I wasn't about to take any chances. I stayed absolutely still, holding my breath, praying that whoever it was would just leave. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. It was quiet for a long time. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I waited in silence, trying to listen for any movement. Thankfully, I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I heard the man's footsteps fading away. I waited a few more minutes just to be sure before I slowly crept to the window and peeked out through the blinds. He was walking back toward his car, got in, and drove off without another word. I don't know who that guy was or what his intentions were, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for a while. The rest of the night, I stayed awake, terrified he might come back. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of having someone standing outside my room, trying to get in. When my family moved into that old rental house, it was clear we'd have our hands full fixing it up. The place was run down, with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and a faint, musty smell that lingered in every room. Still, it was what we could afford, and my parents were optimistic about making it work. I tried to be too, but from the moment we stepped inside, something about the house just felt off. It started with the noises. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I'd hear faint footsteps coming from above, like someone pacing back and forth. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or the wind, or something harmless. But the noises were too deliberate, too human sounding. Sometimes I'd hear soft thumps, as if something had been dropped, or a creak that could only be from a board shifting under weight. When I brought it up to my parents, they brushed it off. My dad joked that it was probably a raccoon throwing a party up there, and my mom said the attic was just old and drafty. It's nothing to worry about, they said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. One afternoon when I was home alone, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to go check the attic myself. The only way up was through a small hatch in the hallway ceiling, with a pull-down ladder that groaned louder than I expected when I unfolded it. Climbing up, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. The attic was dim, lit only by a small, grimy window on the far side. Dust floated in the air, catching the light, and the space smelled faintly of wood and insulation. At first glance, it looked like nothing was up there. Just a few forgotten boxes shoved into a corner. But as I moved closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, near the middle of the attic, were several items scattered across the floor. A crumpled blanket, an empty water bottle, and some food wrappers. The blanket looked worn, like it had been used a lot, and the wrappers were from snacks we didn't even have in the house. I froze. My brain scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't the kind of mess an animal would leave. This was someone's stuff. Someone had been up here, living here, without us knowing. I backed down the ladder as fast as I could and called my dad. He came home a little while later, skeptical but willing to humor me. I insisted he check the attic with me, and when we climbed back up, I pointed to the spot where I'd seen the items. But they weren't scattered anymore. Instead, everything had been neatly piled in a corner, as if someone had come back and tidied up in a hurry. The blanket was folded, the bottle and wrappers stacked beside it. My dad's face shifted from doubtful to concerned in an instant. He called out, asking if anyone was there, but there was no response. He checked every corner of the attic, even the dark spots where I was too scared to look, but there was no sign of anyone. After that, my dad nailed the attic hatch shut. He told me not to worry and said he'd look into getting a pest control service just in case. But I could tell he didn't really believe it was just animals anymore. A few days later, I was cleaning my room when I noticed something strange about the vent near my bed. There was a small piece of paper tucked into the slats. My heart started racing as I pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy but legible, scrawled in pen. "Sorry for the mess. I'm quiet, I promise." I stared at the note, my hands shaking. Someone had been inside the house, close enough to my room to leave this. My mind flashed back to all the nights I'd heard those footsteps, the muffled noises, the creaks in the attic. They weren't just above me. They were here, sharing the same space, watching us live our lives without us even knowing. I showed the note to my parents. My mom turned pale, and my dad immediately called the police. They came and searched the entire house, including the attic, but whoever had been there was long gone. All they found were the same items I'd seen before, blanket, bottle, wrappers, left in that tidy pile in the corner. We never found out who it was or how long they'd been living there. The police guessed it might have been a homeless person who found a way in before we moved and stayed out of sight while we were there. They said it wasn't uncommon in older homes with easy access points like ours. A few weeks later, my parents decided we needed to move. The house had too many bad memories now, too much of a sense that we weren't really alone. Even now, years later, I sometimes lie awake at night wondering who it was, what they wanted, and how many nights they might have watched us without us ever knowing. So, I'm 16 and looking to make extra money babysitting. I posted on Facebook Marketplace, and a woman reached out pretty quickly, saying she needed someone to watch her kids from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day, offering $20 an hour. I was upfront and told her I could only work on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 12 a.m. to 5 p.m. Weirdly, she agreed without hesitation, even though my availability was way off from her initial request. It felt kind of odd, like she was in a hurry or really desperate. I always insist on meeting parents in person before committing to a job, just to make sure everything feels right and that I'll be comfortable working with them. We set up a meeting for the following Thursday, over a week away, to have that chat. The very next day, she messaged me saying I'd missed our meeting on Thursday. I reminded her we had scheduled it for next Thursday, not this one, but she kept insisting we needed to talk about something important before then. She asked if I could pick up groceries and some toys for her family before our meeting. She sent me a message saying, "Yes, you are supposed to come next week, but I want you to get some toys and groceries to bring along for the meeting. I believe you can handle that?" Against my gut feeling, I accepted, trying to stay professional. Then, she sent me money to cover the items, but accidentally sent too much. Her instructions were for me to keep part of the money, use it to buy the items, and then either send the rest back or buy a gift card with the extra. This is where it all clicked. I'd read about scams like this. They send money, you buy something, then refund the extra or buy gift cards. But the original money they sent eventually vanishes, leaving you out of pocket for whatever you spent. I backed out immediately, blocked her, and reported the account. Be careful out there. These people can make things look legit, but are just out to take advantage of you. Working at McDonald's wasn't too bad until I started recognizing a particular face in the drive-thru line almost every shift. He's this guy in his late 30s, a regular now, but there's something about him that makes my skin crawl. He doesn't just place his order and move on. He sits there, staring, with his mouth slightly open. His eyes always drop lower than my face, like he's focused anywhere but my eyes. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then he started talking. Last week he said, "You know, seeing you here just makes my day." I forced a polite laugh, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. A couple of hours later, he pulled up again, just for a burger, this time wearing strange, dirty pajamas, his gaze intense and unwavering. I gave him his food as fast as possible, feeling nervous, and then he asked, "You heading out alone tonight? And you single by any chance?" I managed to shake him off, but he's not backing down. Every shift, he's there, with his lingering gaze and unsettling questions. I told my manager, but he still shows up. I'm starting to think he won't leave me alone until I'm forced to quit. I've been dealing with something unsettling lately, and it's only gotten worse. Here's the story. Last Tuesday, I was leaving work around 9 p.m. and noticed my back license plate was bent at a strange angle. I figured someone might have brushed against my car in the dark parking lot, so I straightened it out and drove home, trying not to overthink it. The next night, I parked outside a friend's apartment. We hung out for a few hours, and when I came back to my car, there were marker scribbles all over the hood. Someone had drawn random symbols and patterns, and my license plate was bent again, this time even worse. It was a shock, and I started feeling like someone was intentionally messing with me. Things escalated on Thursday. After work, I parked in a busy grocery store lot under a bright light. When I came back, the marker scribbles were back, now across my windows and doors, and there were handprints all over the car. It was like whoever was doing this wanted me to know they were close, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, and I was genuinely scared. I told my roommate everything, and we decided it was time to take action. I installed a dash cam that night, hoping to catch whoever was behind this. I checked it every time I went outside, determined to find out who was playing these mind games. Just 2 days later, the camera caught a clear figure by my car in the early morning hours. He wore a hood but didn't bother hiding his face. I took the footage to the police, who immediately recognized him as someone with a history of vandalism and harassment around town. Later that day, they found him loitering in a nearby parking lot and arrested him. When they searched his belongings, they found markers, tools, and a notebook filled with strange symbols. I still don't know why he targeted me, but at least now he's in custody, and I can finally feel safe again. It's a relief to know this nightmare is over. If anything, this whole experience taught me the importance of trusting my gut and of investing in a dash cam. I used to volunteer as a library assistant at the small community center in my neighborhood. I wasn't there for any community service credits or anything. I just loved books and enjoyed the quiet time after school. Sometimes I'd bring a friend, but most days it was just me, organizing shelves or helping the few people who wandered in. One afternoon, I walked in to find the main library area dark and unusually quiet. The librarian was locking up a cabinet when she noticed me. She told me that a staff meeting was scheduled, so the library would be closed early. Disappointed, I turned to leave, but she mentioned something new. A small reading nook had been set up in the basement for young readers. I figured I might as well check it out, imagining a cozy corner with beanbags or maybe a little mural. I didn't want to feel like my trip had been for nothing. The entrance to the basement was tucked around the corner from the main library door, down a long, dim hallway. I had to descend a narrow staircase that seemed much darker than it should have been. As I reached the last few steps, I saw that the door to the reading nook had a handwritten sign saying, "Temporarily closed." Odd, I thought, since it had just been set up. I started to turn back when I noticed a man standing in the shadowed hallway just beyond the last step. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans, and his eyes were fixed directly on me. "Looking for the reading room?" he asked with a slow smile. His voice sounded forced, like he wasn't used to talking. Yeah, but it's closed," I said, glancing at the sign. He stared at me for a few seconds without moving, then muttered, "You can still go inside with me if you want." Every instinct told me to leave. For some reason, though, I just forced myself to stay calm and replied, "No thanks, I'll just wait until it's open." Then turned and walked back up the stairs, feeling his gaze on my back the whole way. After that, I never returned to the library by myself. Every so often, I wonder if I might still see that man around the neighborhood. The thought makes my skin crawl, and I've never told anyone about that day, not even my family. Looking back, I realize how much worse things could have been if I hadn't trusted my gut. am a 40-year-old man and was married for 5 years. Despite having a 4-year-old son whom I adore, my relationship with my wife, a 35-year-old woman, had been on life support for a while. We barely shared anything in common and hadn't had a real conversation about things like money, our future, or our son's college fund. We were essentially roommates, sleeping in separate bedrooms and only being intimate a handful of times each year. Finally, I decided to be honest and told her how I felt. I said I would take responsibility for our son and remain a dedicated father, even if it meant living nearby to be there whenever he needed me. She was furious, of course, but said nothing. After that, I found a place not far from our family home and moved out, hoping that we'd at least be civil for our son's sake. But last night, things took a dark turn. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of glass shattering. Heart racing, I jumped out of bed and rushed to the living room, only to find one of my windows broken. A large rock lay on the carpet, with a piece of paper wrapped around it. I picked it up, hands shaking, and unfolded the note. Written in red pencil were the words, "You broke my heart like this, and now it's your turn. Report this, and you'll never see your son again." I felt my stomach drop, ice-cold dread filling me. It didn't take much to figure out who sent the message. I never thought my wife would go this far. Hurt and angry, yes, but capable of a threat like this? No way. I couldn't understand what I'd done to provoke something so unhinged. My first thought was to call the police, but her words echoed in my mind. I didn't want to risk her taking drastic measures with my son, either legally or through some twisted scheme. Now, I'm in a horrifying predicament. I can't trust her intentions, but I also can't retaliate. It's like a game of chess where my every move could be used against me. So, I'm lying low, trying to keep things as calm as possible while documenting everything in case this escalates further. So I'm a 20-year-old college student, and I'd recently noticed this guy in my chemistry class who just seemed to be everywhere. At first, I didn't think much of it. A lot of people from class study in the library, so it wasn't odd to run into someone there. But then I started noticing him at places like the gym, the cafe near my dorm, and even random hangout spots on campus. Each time, he'd act surprised, like it was this crazy coincidence. One day, he approached me with this casual small talk, then asked for my number, claiming he needed help understanding the chemistry assignments. I didn't think too much of it. Figured maybe if he had my number, he'd stop accidentally running into me. But that was just the beginning. Now he's messaging me constantly about everything from his lunch choices to where he is on campus, asking things like, "Hey, are you around?" Or "You were just here, right?" It was kind of weird. I mean, he wasn't asking about chemistry assignments at all. Instead, it felt like he was tracking me. If I posted a picture, he'd respond within minutes, commenting on the background or asking me to hang out wherever I was. At first, I thought maybe he was just being friendly, trying to connect with someone he knew from class. But the more it happened, the more unsettling it felt. I've started avoiding certain spots just to minimize the chance of bumping into him. But somehow, he always ends up finding these new places I go. It's reached a point where I feel like I'm being watched, even though he's technically not doing anything wrong. He never says anything outright alarming, but it's like this constant low-level pressure, like he's just always there, waiting for me to acknowledge him or respond. I don't know if I'm overthinking it, but it feels like living in a fishbowl, with him on the outside watching every move I make. I'm starting to wonder if he's just socially clueless, or if there's something darker going on, but I have no idea how to handle it without making things more awkward. I've been living in my dorm for a few months now, and everything seemed fine, until I started finding little gifts in my mailbox. At first, it seemed innocent. The first thing was a cheap pen with a red feather attached to it. Nothing too weird. A few days later, there was a keychain with my initials on it. I laughed it off, thinking maybe one of my friends was just trying to be cute or messing with me. But then, things started getting stranger. Last week, I found a small, unmarked notebook with the words, "For your thoughts," written on the cover in a messy scrawl. Inside, the first few pages were filled with little doodles and notes. My class schedule, random things about my day, even some places I'd been to recently. It freaked me out. None of my friends would go this far, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone was watching me. Then a guy in my psychology class, Josh, I think his name is, casually mentioned my dorm location in conversation. "Nice area you live in. I used to live close to there," he said, like we were old friends. I barely knew him, and that's when my stomach dropped. I brushed it off, but later that day, he sent me a message asking if I'd found the latest gift. When I didn't reply, he sent another one. "I hope you like it. You'll love what's coming next." I told him to stop, tried to make it clear that this was seriously creeping me out, but he just laughed it off. He keeps telling me it's just a fun game, and insists that I'll love his surprises. Last night, he mentioned my schedule again, even noting which building I'd be in at certain times. Now, every time I leave class, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him watching me. It's like he's always one step ahead. I've reported it to campus security, but without proof of harassment, they can't do much. I hate going back to my dorm now, always wondering what's waiting in my mailbox. Or worse, who's watching. I've never felt so trapped in my own life. It all started when my boyfriend's ex somehow got a hold of my number. I'd be asleep at 2 or 3 a.m. when my phone would buzz, only to find it was a private number that would hang up as soon as I answered. The calls became constant, especially at night. I tried to ignore them, thinking maybe it was just a phase she'd eventually give up on, but things only escalated. One day, I noticed strange devices listed on our Wi-Fi that neither my boyfriend nor I recognized. I'd delete them, only for them to pop up again a few days later. I'm no tech expert, but I knew something was off. And then came the social media issues. My passwords would stop working, and I'd have to reset them multiple times, only for the same thing to happen days later. At one point, she managed to set up a fake profile using my photos, pretending to be me, and sending hateful messages to people I know. The worst part was when I almost got banned from my job's social media account because of the horrible things I was supposedly saying. The most unsettling thing, though, has been the car incidents. For a full week, I'd wake up to find my tires mysteriously low on air. My boyfriend checked for any leaks, but the mechanics found nothing wrong. The low tire pressure kept happening until I started parking in different spots and setting up a security camera by the driveway. I haven't caught her on camera yet, but I'm convinced she's behind it. I've tried talking to my boyfriend about how far this has gone, but he doesn't seem to understand just how overwhelming and invasive this feels. Every time I hear a strange noise, I get anxious, thinking she's outside, watching, or doing something else to sabotage my life. It feels like there's no safe space anymore. All I want is for this to stop, so I can get back to living my life without constantly looking over my shoulder. I am an 18-year-old female, and I am part of a few study groups and clubs on campus. I joined them to make new friends and network a bit, but lately, it's been odd. There's this one guy, let's call him Mark, who somehow always ends up in every group I'm in. At first, I didn't think too much of it. It's a small campus, so I figured it could just be coincidence. But then he joined the latest study group I joined, and when he spotted me, he smiled and said, "Guess we're both interested in the same stuff." I laughed it off, trying to keep things light. But as the weeks went by, Mark's behavior got weird. He started messaging me about every group's activities. Whenever we had a study session or event, he'd text me, asking if I wanted to prepare together beforehand. I tried being polite, saying I had a lot going on and sometimes needed time alone. But he just brushed it off with comments like, "Oh, no worries. I'm not stalking you or anything. Just thought we'd make a good team." Still, he kept showing up, always finding a way to sit next to me, no matter where we met. Even worse, he'd bring up things I'd mentioned in one club during conversations in another, as if he'd memorized everything I said. It felt like he was keeping a mental record of all my activities, and the more he did it, the more uncomfortable I felt. Once, I casually mentioned to a friend that I was thinking of skipping a study session, and Mark showed up outside my dorm, saying, "I figured you'd be here since you weren't in class." Now it's like he's lurking in every corner of my campus life. I even started skipping meetings just to avoid him, but he'd still find ways to message me, asking if I was okay and saying it wasn't the same without me there. I'm torn between confronting him and just hoping he'll get the hint. But right now, it feels like I have a shadow following me everywhere I go. It's draining, and I don't feel safe in any of my usual hangouts. I'm from New Zealand, and this happened in 2019. After a late shift at the coffee shop I work at, I was finally heading home, craving nothing more than a hot shower and some sleep. The night was damp and chilly, and only a few scattered lights lit the narrow road leading to my apartment. Just as I was about to reach my door, I spotted a figure bundled up right against it, like they'd taken refuge there. As I got closer, I saw it was a middle-aged man, hunched over and clutching a newspaper like a blanket. I could barely make out his face, but his eyes, they were unsettling, glaring up at me from under the brim of a weathered cap. I froze. Slowly, he raised an old, rusty umbrella, pointing it directly at me with a shaky, firm grip. His voice cracked as he snarled, "Back off, mate." His breath smelled sour and rotten, and his skin was rough and leathery. I was speechless. This was my place, but he seemed desperate, almost feral. I tried to reason with him, but he swung the umbrella in my direction, twice, grazing my shoulder. My fight or flight kicked in, and I quickly backed away, walking briskly down the street. Eventually, I found a police officer on patrol, explained what happened, and he agreed to walk back with me. By the time we returned, the porch was empty. Only a few crumpled newspapers remained. The officer shrugged, and I thanked him, but that uneasy feeling never quite left. Even now, I catch myself looking twice at my doorstep before I unlock the door. I am a 22-year-old female. This happened a few months ago, and it's been freaking me out ever since. I accepted a friend request from a guy I vaguely remembered from a class last semester. We'd spoken a couple of times, nothing major, but he seemed chill, so I thought, why not? Big mistake. Within days, he started tagging me in random posts, memes, weird articles, even links to obscure local events. At first, I just ignored them, thinking he'd stop once he got no response. But then the DMs started rolling in. Did you see what I tagged you in? Why didn't you react? I thought you'd like that. It felt a little off, but I figured maybe he was just trying to be friendly. So, I replied once, telling him I'd seen it, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. Instead, he escalated. Now he was tagging me daily, sometimes multiple times a day, and he'd comment on every photo I uploaded, like he was trying to act like we were best friends. "Oh, I remember this," or "this looks familiar," were his favorite lines. But the thing is, we'd never hung out, not once outside of those 2 casual conversations in class. It was bizarre. One day, I asked him directly to stop tagging me so much. His reaction caught me off guard. He immediately got defensive, saying I was overreacting and too sensitive. He even tried to guilt trip me, claiming he was just being nice and trying to include me in his interests. It gave me this sick feeling, like he was trying to dictate how I should respond to his every little nudge. Now I feel like I can't post anything without imagining his reaction, wondering if he'll twist it somehow to drag me back into his weird little game. I've stopped posting altogether and have muted him. Please help me. This happened in Detroit a couple of years ago after a night shift at my job. It was around 3 a.m., and the city had that eerie, quiet stillness it gets at that hour. I parked my car and noticed someone sitting on the curb just a few feet from my building entrance. He looked like a guy around my age, maybe a little older, with dark clothes and a cigarette dangling from his fingers. As I walked by, he muttered, "Got a light?" I stopped to pull out my lighter, but when I got close, he suddenly grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. His eyes were wild and glazed over as he leaned in and whispered, "You're in my seat. Don't come back here again, all right?" The whole interaction was so jarring that I pulled away without a word, heading straight inside and locking the door. The next night he was gone, but every time I parked in that spot, I found myself looking around, expecting him to show up. I eventually asked the building manager to change my parking spot. I'm a 21-year-old female, and I've been dating my boyfriend, a 24-year-old male, for a little over 2 years now. Up until recently, things have been really great. He's been respectful, thoughtful, and I've always felt safe with him. But a few nights ago, something happened that's left me feeling uneasy, and I'm not sure how to process it. We were having a regular evening together, nothing unusual at first. But as the night went on, he started getting more intense than usual. We have a system where if one of us feels uncomfortable or wants to slow down, we use a specific word as a signal. I didn't think much of it when I first used it, just thought he'd gotten a bit carried away and would pull back. But he didn't. I waited for a moment, hoping he'd realize I'd given the signal, but nothing changed. I said it louder, and even then, he only paused for a second before brushing it off, like he didn't hear me. I ended up having to really get his attention to make him stop. Afterward, he seemed normal again, so I asked what was going on and why he ignored our signal. That's when he admitted, almost casually, that he found it exciting to push boundaries a little. I felt a wave of confusion and unease. I didn't want to overreact in the moment, so I didn't say much then. But now I can't shake this feeling. Part of me feels like I'm overthinking it. but another part is genuinely disturbed by the idea that he thought it was okay to ignore something we agreed on just because he found it thrilling. I'm really torn. On one hand, I care about him a lot, and I don't want to assume the worst. But on the other hand, I can't ignore that he broke an agreement we had, one that was supposed to keep both of us safe and comfortable. I feel like if I can't trust him with something as basic as that, then what does that mean for our relationship? Have any of you ever been in a similar situation? How did you handle it? I want to have an honest conversation with him, but I'm worried about how he'll react. Any advice would be really helpful. For the past year, I've been dealing with a stalker, someone who's made it their mission to unsettle me in ways I didn't think were possible. It started with strange, anonymous messages. At first, I brushed it off as a prank or a scammer trying to mess with me, but the persistence quickly escalated beyond anything typical. No matter how many times I changed my number, the messages would eventually start rolling in again, sometimes within days. They always knew my first name, always seemed aware of little details that no stranger would. Every time I switched numbers, I'd breathe a little easier for a few days, only for the creeping dread to return as soon as that first message popped up again. I felt trapped, not knowing who it was or how they kept getting my number. I tried to ignore it, hoping that maybe it would just go away if I didn't engage. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, someone close by. Desperate, I turned to one of my closest friends. She listened, horrified, and then suggested that maybe I should try getting a number that I shared with no one but her at first. Then, I could slowly give it out to other people, carefully, until we had some idea of how this person was getting my contact info. It was a solid plan, and the best idea I had heard yet. So, I went and got a new number, and for the first few days, everything was quiet. I only shared it with my friend, then slowly a few more people I trusted. One day, after I'd vented about it to a neighbor while sharing my number with her, she looked uncomfortable. I could tell she knew something, so I pressed a little. Finally, she admitted that her son might have something to do with it. Apparently, he'd been watching out for me for some time, and his fixation was deeper than I realized. With this knowledge, I confronted him. I let his friends know about his disturbing actions and immediately reported him to the police. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the unsettling feeling that someone I saw nearly every day was responsible. Since then, he's been ordered to stay away from me, and thankfully, I haven't heard from him since. But the experience has forever changed how safe I feel, even in my own neighborhood. This happened a couple of years ago when I was teaching English in Seoul. I had just finished a late evening class and was walking back to my apartment. The city is usually bustling, but that night, my street was eerily quiet, which is rare. As I approached my building, I saw an old woman sitting cross-legged in front of the entryway, clutching a red scarf in her hands. I tried to be polite, giving her a nod as I walked by, but she suddenly started rocking back and forth, whispering, "No, not yet, not yet." Her voice was hoarse, almost like a chant. I felt a chill, but didn't want to be rude, so I kept walking. Just as I reached the door, she leapt up and grabbed my wrist, her fingers cold as ice. She stared into my eyes and said in a shaky voice, "Don't let them in." I asked her who she was talking about, but she just dropped my wrist and slumped back down, going silent. When I glanced back, she was still sitting there, clutching that red scarf. She was gone the next morning, but I never looked at that entryway the same way. I was 16 when I got my first job at a local vet's office. It wasn't much, mostly helping out, taking notes, organizing files, and comforting owners whose pets were sick. I loved animals, so even if the pay was minimum wage, I was thrilled. Little did I know, my excitement would be overshadowed by one client who gave me the creeps from the start. He started coming in every few weeks with his husky, a beautiful dog, big and fluffy with the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. The man, though, gave off a different vibe. He was well-dressed, always in designer clothes, and drove a shiny black BMW. The first time he came in, he smiled at me a bit too warmly, asking me my name and age, lingering in a way that made me squirm. Each time he visited, he'd try to strike up a conversation. He'd compliment my hair, my clothes, anything he could think of to get me to talk. I'd always give him short answers and focus on my work, hoping he'd get the hint. But he never did. One day, he offered me a ride in his car, saying he could take me out for a real meal. I remember feeling my skin crawl as he said it, his eyes on me in a way that felt wrong. I turned him down politely, explaining that my parents didn't let me accept rides from strangers. He just laughed, like he found it funny, and said, "Well, maybe someday they'll let you." Over the next few months, he continued to bring his husky, each time trying a little harder. He'd leave expensive chocolates on the counter with a note saying, "For the pretty girl at the desk," or a coffee he thought I'd like. I made sure to throw them away when he wasn't looking, my stomach knotting every time he walked in. I told my boss about it, but he brushed it off, saying the guy was just friendly and probably lonely. Eventually, the man stopped coming in. Weeks passed, and I forgot about him, relieved that he seemed to have moved on. Years went by. I was now in college, and one night, while scrolling through the news, I saw a familiar face on the screen. It was him, older now, but the same intense eyes. My heart pounded as I read the headline. He was arrested and accused of doing unspeakable things to a teenage girl who had been missing for months. Details in the article revealed that he had befriended her over time, gained her trust, and then things had taken a horrific turn. My mind flashed back to every uncomfortable encounter we'd had, every friendly offer, every time he'd tried to get close to me. It was chilling to think that I could have been another headline. All the little alarms I'd ignored, the gut feeling that told me something was off, it was all valid. I don't work at the vet anymore, but I still think about that job sometimes, wondering how close I came to something truly terrifying. And every time I see someone brushing off another person's concerns, I remember how easy it is to dismiss that gut feeling. Now I don't. I listen to it like my life depends on it, because maybe once upon a time it did. I'll never forget the night I tried to sell my AirPods on Facebook Marketplace. I'm usually a pretty careful guy. I check profiles, look for red flags, and never invite strangers over without making sure everything looks legit. This time seemed no different. The buyer seemed normal. We'd messaged back and forth, agreed on a price, and even shared a couple of short calls to finalize the details. I live in an apartment building, so I only gave him the address, but never my unit number. Just a little precaution, you know? When he called to say he'd arrived, I went downstairs and out of the building. As I stepped outside, I saw not one, but 3 guys waiting on the sidewalk. I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about 3 people showing up for a simple AirPod sale, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe they were friends tagging along. Didn't seem too unusual at the moment. They greeted me, and I put on my best casual face and handed them the AirPods to inspect. They started fiddling with the case, acting like they were checking if everything worked. But before I even registered what was happening, they turned and bolted, disappearing down the street in a full sprint. My heart dropped, and I instinctively ran after them. It wasn't even about the AirPods at that point. It was the shock, the anger of being played like that. I kept running, thinking I could catch up, but they ducked around a corner and vanished. When I reached the corner, I slowed down, trying to catch my breath and scan the shadows for any sign of them. But in that instant, I felt something hard smash into the back of my head. I staggered and fell to the ground, seeing stars. I didn't even realize I was losing consciousness until everything went black. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital room, head throbbing, vision hazy. A nurse was there, telling me that a passerby had seen me lying in the alley and called for an ambulance. I couldn't believe what had happened. The police came to take a report, but I barely had any information to give them. I'd been so focused on the guy I'd messaged that I hadn't even looked closely at the other two. In the end, they never found the guys. My AirPods were gone, and I was left with a splitting headache and a hospital bill. The experience shook me to my core. I couldn't stop replaying the scene over and over, kicking myself for walking right into a trap. Now, every time I consider selling something online, I think twice and insist on meeting in well-lit public places. It's not worth the risk of trusting strangers, no matter how normal they seem online. I matched with a seemingly great guy on Tinder, but he had a terrifying secret. So about 6 months ago, I matched with this guy on Tinder. Let's call him Jake. His profile was pretty normal. Single, no kids, a few shared interests, and he seemed to have his life together. We exchanged numbers, started chatting over text, and eventually spoke on the phone pretty regularly. He had this calming, charming way about him that made me feel comfortable, which isn't something I often feel with people from dating apps. We met up in person a few times, and I'll admit, I started catching feelings. He was always courteous, came to pick me up from my place, and treated me well. It felt like everything was going smoothly. After about 3 months of talking, I decided to double-check one thing, just for my peace of mind. I asked him again, "Are you sure you don't have kids?" He paused, then said, "Actually, yeah, I do." My heart dropped. It wasn't just that he had kids. People have kids, it's not a big deal. But he lied about it for months. I felt like I'd been tricked into building something that wasn't real. It was a huge red flag for me, so I told him gently that I didn't feel comfortable continuing if he hadn't been honest from the start. After some tense back and forth, I typed out a message saying I couldn't keep seeing him because of the dishonesty. Then, nothing. He didn't reply. I thought that was it, that he'd just ghosted, and I tried to put it out of my mind. But later that night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud banging on my front door. Heart racing, I stumbled out of bed and peeked through the peephole. There he was, Jake, looking completely unhinged. His hair was disheveled, he could barely stand still, clearly drunk, and he was slurring his words, cursing me out, and yelling that I was making a huge mistake. I was terrified. I called the police immediately. They showed up pretty quickly, managed to calm him down, and took him away. I thought maybe this was a one-time thing, that he just couldn't handle rejection and had a bit too much to drink. But it didn't stop there. Over the next couple of weeks, he showed up a few more times, each time around the same hour, each time banging on my door and threatening me. I was barely sleeping, afraid I'd wake up to him breaking down the door, or worse. The final straw was when he showed up with flowers at 3 a.m. and alternated between begging me to take him back and cursing me out when I didn't respond. I was shaking when I called the police again, and they finally helped me get a restraining order against him. I've since changed my locks, added a security camera, and deleted every dating app. I still get chills thinking about him showing up in the middle of the night. So, this happened to me a few months ago, and honestly, it still sends chills down my spine. I'd met this girl, Sarah, on Bumble, and things seemed almost too good to be true. We clicked immediately. We'd meet up at different cafes, go to the movies, grab dinner, and it all felt like a natural progression. Every time we hung out, she seemed so genuine and sweet, like she was really into me. Then one night, I was just chilling at home, watching TV. Out of nowhere, I hear this loud crash, like someone just threw a brick through my window. My heart immediately starts pounding as I rush to the hallway, and there it was, a shattered window with a huge rock lying on the ground. I remember thinking, who in the world would do something like this? I hesitated to look out the window, but curiosity got the better of me. That's when I saw him, a tall guy, easily over 6 feet, just standing there, gripping a knife in his hand. I was frozen. My mind was racing. I finally managed to yell out, "What do you want? Are you crazy?" And what he said next made my blood run cold. "I think you're the crazy one," he snarled, "dating a married woman." I felt like my whole world had just flipped upside down. Married? Sarah never even hinted at being married. I didn't even know what to say. Before I could process it, the guy lunged at me, climbing halfway through the broken window, trying to get inside. I didn't think. I just reacted. I turned and ran, sprinting to my bedroom and locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, barely able to get the words out. Meanwhile, I could hear him in the hallway, banging on my bedroom door, kicking it, yelling all sorts of threats. It was like something out of a nightmare. He kept saying things like, "You messed with the wrong man's wife, and I'll make you regret this." I felt trapped, with nothing but a thin door between me and him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens. Just as the guy managed to bust the door open, the police were already in my house, tackling him before he could reach me. They cuffed him, and he was screaming the entire time as they dragged him out. I was still in shock, trying to piece together everything that had just happened. Once things calmed down, I tried to call Sarah. I needed answers, but she didn't pick up. I texted her, trying to understand if any of this was real or if it was some sick joke. But then I realized she'd blocked me. Just like that, she was gone from my life without a single explanation. Looking back, I feel like I was living in some horror movie. Sarah had seemed so normal, so real. But now, I wonder if anything she ever told me was true. So, this happened a few years back. I was taking a late-night train across a few towns to meet some friends for the weekend. It was winter, bitterly cold, and almost deserted at that hour. I remember thinking it would be a peaceful, empty ride where I could just zone out until I got to my stop. I was wrong. After settling in, a man sat down next to me. He looked like he was in his late 30s, wearing a worn-out coat and a beanie that barely stayed on his head. He was jittery, glancing around the empty car like he expected someone to pop out from the shadows. But it was only us, as far as I could see. At first, I didn't think much of him. Just another passenger, maybe a bit on edge from traveling alone at night. I figured if I kept my headphones on, he'd leave me alone. But before I could plug in, he started talking to me. "Cold night, huh?" he said, and I nodded. Simple enough conversation at first. But as the train chugged along, he kept talking, almost like he was desperate for company. I got the sense he'd been carrying something heavy and needed to let it out. Against my better judgment, I played along, asking him where he was headed, what he was doing out so late. I thought it might calm him down. That's when he started sharing things I didn't expect. He told me he'd been drinking a lot lately, and not just casual drinking. He was getting absolutely wasted to the point of blacking out. He even confessed he had done something bad. Alarm bells started ringing, but I kept quiet, not wanting to provoke him. Then, almost in a whisper, he told me he'd killed someone. I froze. He went on, his voice almost a mumble, explaining that he and a friend got into a fight over money while they were both drunk. In the heat of the moment, he claimed he'd done something terrible, something he couldn't take back. His friend was dead, and now he was on the run. My heart was pounding. Here I was, stuck next to a man who might be a murderer, who seemed to be barely holding it together. I didn't know if he had a weapon, or if he was capable of snapping again. I felt trapped, trying to look calm, my eyes glued to the door, praying for my stop to come soon. After what felt like an eternity, the train started slowing down. It was my stop, and I carefully excused myself, trying not to make any sudden movements. I expected him to stop me, or do something, anything. But he just sat there, staring at the floor. As I got off the train and into the cold night air, I felt a rush of relief. But it wasn't over. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of sitting next to that man. Every time I heard about a crime on the news, my mind would wander back to that night. I don't know what happened to him, and I don't think I want to. But that ride left a mark on me. To this day, I can't ride a train at night without looking over my shoulder. I had one of the scariest, most humiliating experiences of my life today, and I still feel a mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. My boyfriend and I decided to take a walk in the park. It was one of those beautiful days, crisp autumn air and sunlight filtering through the leaves, perfect for some quiet time together. We'd been walking for a while, laughing and enjoying the scenery, when he realized he forgot to bring water. So he ran to the nearby convenience store to grab us a couple of bottles, leaving me outside near the entrance. While waiting, I was just minding my own business, scrolling through my phone. There were plenty of people around, families, couples, joggers, and I felt safe. After all, it was broad daylight in a public place. Then out of nowhere, I felt a sharp slap on my posterior. I froze. The sensation and shock were overwhelming. My first reaction was confusion, but as I turned my head, I saw a man, maybe in his 40s, walking away with this self-satisfied smirk. Before he left, he looked back and said, "Nice posterior, wish it were mine," and then just kept walking like nothing had happened. I felt so many things at once. Humiliation, anger, disgust, even fear. I stood there speechless, not knowing what to do. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and immediately called my boyfriend. He could tell from my voice that something was wrong. and before I even explained, he told me to stay put and that he was on his way back. When he arrived a few minutes later, he was so angry and worried. I told him what happened, and he looked like he was ready to explode. He scanned the area, but the man was already long gone. We spent the next half hour walking around the park, hoping we might see the guy again, but there was no sign of him. My boyfriend wanted to report it to the police, but I wasn't sure what they could do. I didn't know if it would help or if they'd just brush it off. Eventually, we decided to go home. The worst part was the way it made me feel. I've always heard stories of things like this happening to women, but you never really understand how violating it is until it happens to you. It's just so unfair. I was out enjoying my day, and this guy decided he had the right to touch me without consent, to humiliate me in public. Now, I feel anxious even thinking about going to that park again. So, here's the story I never thought I'd be writing. I'm 25, married, and have been dealing with an addiction to intimacy for years. Therapy has been a constant in my life since I was 18, and I've been trying to work through my issues. I thought I had made progress, thought I was doing better, and then, last week, I messed up. Big time. I ended up betraying my wife, not once, but with 5 people, 3 men and 2 women. I know it sounds horrible, and here's the kicker. I've always considered myself a straight man. I love my wife, and I'm disgusted with myself. I never thought I would end up here, hurting her like this. She's always been a strict Christian, and her values are very important to her. She's been clear about her stance on things like infidelity and same-gender relationships, and I know if she found out, it would be the end of us. To make things even worse, one of the men I was intimate with found out I'm married and is now threatening to tell my wife everything if I don't continue seeing him. It's like I'm trapped in a nightmare that I created. I know I brought this on myself, but the fear of losing everything, especially my wife, is eating me alive. The guy has been sending me messages non-stop, basically giving me ultimatums. I feel like I can't tell anyone in my life about this. It's just too much, too shameful. Every time my phone buzzes, my heart races, worried that it's him with another demand. He knows how religious my wife is, and has hinted that he could even reach out to her family. I know I need to make a choice, but every option feels like losing. Do I tell my wife the truth and risk the fallout? Or do I keep giving in to this person's demands and hope he eventually leaves me alone? It feels like there's no way out, no way that doesn't lead to my life completely falling apart. I realize I'm asking for sympathy for a situation I created, but I don't know where else to turn. Has anyone been in a similar situation? Any advice on how to handle blackmail like this? Or how to even begin approaching the mess I've made? I don't want to lose my wife, but I know I can't keep hiding this forever. And if she ever found out, I'd rather it be from me than someone else. Thanks for listening this far. I feel like I'm drowning and don't know what to do. If anyone has been through something remotely similar or has any advice, I could really use some help. I know I messed up, and I know there's no easy fix, but I can't just keep going like this. So this is still fresh, but I just need to get it out somewhere. I'm a 20-year-old guy, and last night I was walking home alone. It was late, around midnight, and the streets were mostly empty. I was keeping to myself, just lost in my own thoughts, when I noticed someone approaching from the opposite direction. I I didn't think much of it at first, but as he got closer, I felt something was off. As soon as he was in front of me, he pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming, a mugging. I was scared, but adrenaline kicked in hard. He demanded my wallet, but my fight-or-flight instincts took over. Without even thinking, I made a grab for his wrist, hoping to disarm him. I missed though, and he fired. The bullet grazed my leg, leaving a nasty scar that I'm probably going to have for the rest of my life. Seeing the look in his eyes and feeling the burn on my leg, something in me just snapped. I don't know if it was survival instincts or pure anger, but I found myself shoving him as hard as I could. He stumbled backward, and I took advantage of it. I kicked him in the jaw, hard, in a south to north motion. The impact felt so surreal, almost like time had slowed down, but there was no room for hesitation. I kicked him again while he was down. It all happened so fast, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, he was down, clutching his face in pain, and I took off before he could recover, limping all the way home. When I got there, I cleaned up the wound and sat down, shaking, as the weight of what happened started to sink in. Growing up, I was always taught that violence in self-defense is morally justified, that sometimes, when you're in real danger, you've got to protect yourself however you can. I believe that, still do. But actually having to defend myself like that, to be in a situation where I was hurting someone else to protect myself, felt brutal. There's this disturbing reality to it that I wasn't prepared for. The violence wasn't a movie fight scene or a sparring session. It was raw, painful, and terrifying. I never thought I'd be capable of that level of aggression, even if it was justified. There's a strange, hollow feeling now. Part of me is grateful I made it out, but another part of me feels heavy with guilt. I know he would have hurt me if he had the chance, but still, it's hard to shake off the feeling of what I had to do to get away. This experience left me questioning so much. My own beliefs, my sense of safety, and what I'm actually capable of. Violence in self-defense is supposed to be simple, but when you're the one doing it, it's anything but. It was around 3 a.m., and I'd just gotten out of the bath. I was still dripping wet, drying off, when I heard a loud, echoing thud from the front of the house. My first thought was that it must have been my imagination, maybe even something random that had fallen over. But then I heard a second, unmistakable crash, the kind of sound that sends chills down your spine. Someone was breaking down my front door. At that moment, I was completely exposed. No clothes, no weapon, no plan, and utterly vulnerable. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this, but instincts took over. I had a handgun stored nearby in my bedroom, so I sprinted for it. I had no time to dress or even put on a towel. The adrenaline was so intense that I hardly even noticed the cold or that I was soaking wet. I could hear them now, moving inside, muttering to each other. And they weren't just petty thieves. They were armed with crowbars, smashing through anything in their path. This wasn't some innocent mistake or wrong address. These guys were here to do harm, and I wasn't going to let that happen in my own home. They got closer, and I waited, heart pounding, gun at the ready. I didn't want to think, didn't want to second-guess anything. These weren't unarmed intruders. They had weapons and were prepared to use them. When the first guy came into view, it was like time slowed down. I gave him a chance to see me, to realize what he was up against, but he didn't back down. I pulled the trigger, aiming to end this nightmare right then and there. Chaos erupted. I won't go into every detail, but it was brutal, raw, and terrifying. I had to fight for my life, and I didn't hold back. I wasn't thinking about consequences, morality, or what the police might say. I was only thinking about survival. In the end, I had won the fight. I drove them off, left them scrambling out of my house, injured, but alive. I don't regret a single thing. I protected myself, my home, and my life, and I would do it again in a heartbeat. If things had ended differently, if I'd taken them down right then and there, I wouldn't have lost a wink of sleep over it. These two had come into my home armed and prepared to do serious damage. I was naked, defenseless, and forced to react in the most primal way possible. I don't feel guilty. I don't feel remorse. If anything, I feel empowered. I was tested in the most intense way possible, and I stood my ground. Now, I know there will be people who say I should have done this or that differently. But until they've stood where I stood, they don't get a say. I live in an apartment complex, and a few months ago, the woman living directly below me started acting strange. At first, it was just her coming to my door every now and then, always looking a bit flustered. But over time, her visits got more intense. She'd bang on my door, her face red and her voice shaking with anger as she accused me of making her life unbearable. According to her, there were constant noises and vibrations coming from my apartment that were shaking her whole place. She claimed that whatever I was doing up here was so loud and disruptive that it rattled her walls and floors non-stop. The problem was, I wasn't making any noise. I don't even have a TV, and aside from that, nothing was running in my apartment. No washer, no dishwasher, nothing unusual. I work a 9-to-5 job, so I'm not even home most of the day. I don't have a pet or anyone else living with me, so I genuinely had no clue what she was talking about. I tried explaining this to her, but she wouldn't hear it. She insisted that the noise was coming from my unit, and at one point, she demanded to come inside to check for herself. I had to put my foot down there. I wasn't about to let her barge into my place to confirm something I knew wasn't happening. So, I told her that if she was having these issues, she needed to talk to the property management company. I even suggested that maybe there was a structural issue in the building, like faulty plumbing or wiring, that could be causing these strange noises and vibrations. Things didn't improve. If anything, her accusations escalated. She came up more frequently, each time more agitated than the last. I was starting to feel uneasy in my own home, always on edge, wondering if she'd come storming up to my door over some invisible disturbance. Finally, after months of this exhausting back and forth, she moved out. I happened to catch her dad helping with the move, and we ended up talking for a few minutes. That's when I learned the woman was schizophrenic and had been struggling with severe symptoms. Her dad seemed heartbroken, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sympathy for both of them. Here I was, frustrated and scared, but she was genuinely living a nightmare in her mind every day. Looking back, it was a relief when she moved out, but there's a lingering sadness too. She was going through something beyond her control, and as scary and upsetting as it was to deal with on my end, I can't imagine how much harder it must have been for her, feeling constantly tormented by things that weren't even there. I hope she's able to find some peace, and I also hope that her family can find a way to support her through this. Living above her during that time was intense and challenging, but in the end, it was a stark reminder of how mental illness can shape people's lives and interactions in ways that are difficult for others to understand. Years ago, I lived with my family in a quiet, unsettling little town that felt lost in time. It was the kind of place with narrow roads, dim streetlights, and dense woods surrounding it like a protective, yet suffocating barrier. What added to the strange vibe was our neighbor, an older woman who called herself a divine spirit. She didn't just think highly of herself, she actually had followers. People who believed in her, worshipped her, and even gathered outside her house in reverence day and night. As a teenager, I found her and her devotees bizarre and more than a little creepy. Our house was 2 stories, and I'd often watch from my bedroom balcony on the 2nd floor, peeking through the curtains. I could see them forming circles around her house, chanting in low voices that floated on the still night air. Sometimes they burned incense. Other times, they held strange, reflective objects in their hands that caught the moonlight, casting odd shadows on the ground. The rituals weren't limited to the day. I remember waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning to see them gathering outside her house, their voices echoing eerily across the otherwise silent neighborhood. My curiosity was strong, but my fear was stronger. I kept my distance, always watching, but never engaging. When I moved to the city for college, I felt relieved to leave that creepy town behind, thinking I'd escaped the oppressive, bizarre atmosphere of our neighborhood for good. Years passed, and I didn't think much about that place. But eventually, I returned to visit my family. I took the bus back, and as we entered the town, I felt a strange sense of unease. Everything looked the same, yet somehow different, like the shadows had grown darker and the streets more twisted in my absence. Then I saw it. The bus slowed down, and there, tied to the old oak tree at the town's entrance, was something. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. From a distance, it looked like a weathered statue, hunched over and wrapped in tattered cloth. But as the bus drew nearer, I realized with a jolt of horror that it was a desiccated body, bound upright to the tree with thick ropes. My stomach churned as I took in its hollow eyes, stretched skin, and twisted limbs. The figure wore the remnants of clothes that looked faintly familiar. Confused and horrified, I turned to the man next to me and asked who, or what, that thing was. He looked at me as though the answer was obvious. "That's her," he said simply, "the divine spirit. She passed last year, but they wouldn't let her go. They desiccated her body and tied her to the tree so she'd watch over the town forever. People still come to her. They say if you have a wish or need guidance, you just whisper it to her and she'll answer. Some say she speaks back in dreams." I sat back, heart pounding, and tried to process this disturbing revelation. It was like something out of a horror story. I spent the rest of the ride in stunned silence, dreading what other changes I'd find in the town. I had only come back to visit my family, but now all I wanted was to leave and never look back. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but hey, when you're young, naive, and trying to make quick cash, things get real in ways you can't predict. I was 16 and honestly thought I was untouchable. My job at the time was pretty simple. A friend of mine and I were selling small amounts of pot to cover our own supply. Nothing huge or sketchy, just a little extra cash on the side. One night, I set up a sale with these 2 guys I didn't know very well. Word was, they'd been ripping off small-time sellers around town, but I figured, it's just 4 grams. What could go wrong? I met up in this secluded spot near an alley. Not a smart thing, I know, but at the time, it felt low-key enough not to draw any attention. As soon as we started talking, I could tell something was off. The guy I was dealing with wasn't just looking to make a quick buy. He was watching me, sizing me up, like he was daring me to try something. I didn't feel great about it, but I just wanted to get the deal done and go. He told me to hand over the stuff first, and I did, figuring that if things went south, I could just walk away. Well, the guy takes the bag, grins, and says something like, "That's all? You're not even going to try to put up a fight?" I remember feeling my stomach drop, but I played it cool. "Nah, man, just take it. I don't want any trouble. It's only 4 grams anyway." But that wasn't enough for him. Next thing I know, he reaches into his pocket, pulls out a knife, and steps toward me. I froze. I was just a kid with 0 experience in fights, let alone someone pulling a weapon on me. He swings the knife, and I feel this sharp pull against my chest. The sound of tearing fabric was louder than I expected. It was my coat getting sliced right down the middle. Thankfully, my coat was one of those bulky ones you wear to survive harsh winters. The knife didn't reach me, but it shook me up enough to make me stumble back. In the chaos, I remember thinking, "Just get out. Move." I bolted toward my beat-up car, heart racing, only to find out these guys had slashed my tires too. My getaway plan was as shredded as my coat. I ended up running all the way home, practically hyperventilating the whole way. When I finally got back and took a breath, I looked at my coat and saw the knife had cut through 3 layers of fabric. If I'd been wearing anything thinner, I don't know what would have happened. After that night, I quit selling. The whole experience messed me up. It was like a wake-up call, a harsh reminder that life isn't a game and that a few grams of weed aren't worth risking your life over. So, I was on my way home from work, just your average evening routine. My bus stop was pretty quiet at first, but then I noticed this guy acting off. He was pacing and shouting, getting more and more aggressive by the minute. At one point, he even started yelling that he was going to kill someone. Obviously, this was concerning, so I went to find a member of the station staff and reported it to them. They thanked me, but honestly, I wasn't sure what they'd be able to do. I decided not to wait around, so I figured I'd hail a cab. Just before I left, I looked around one last time, trying to make sure that the guy was out of sight. I had no idea that would be a mistake. In the split second I turned my back, I heard fast footsteps behind me. Before I could react, he was right there, too close. Out of nowhere, he sprayed me in the face with pepper spray, and the pain was immediate. My eyes burned so badly I could barely see. All I knew was that I had to get away, fast. My instincts kicked in, and I started running, gasping for air and trying to wipe the mace out of my eyes as best as I could. But he wasn't letting up. He came after me, shouting and waving a gun. My brain was in survival mode, trying to find an escape route. But every turn I took, he seemed to get closer. Eventually, I backed into a corner. I was trapped. The only thing I had on me were my combat boots, but I figured they'd have to do. I waited until he got close enough, and then I kicked him with everything I had, aiming right between his legs. The sound he made was something I'll never forget. He fell to the ground, doubled over, holding his crotch and vomiting from the pain. It was brutal to witness. I'd never seen another person in that much agony, and to know that I was the one who caused it was disturbing on a level I can't fully describe. It was almost like an out-of-body experience, seeing someone like that because of something I'd done. But, as disturbing as it was, I didn't feel guilty. I hadn't started this fight. He'd chosen to attack me, an innocent bystander with a weapon, and he'd left me with no choice. The staff rushed over after that and called the cops, who eventually arrived and took him into custody. I think back to that day often. It's a strange mix of emotions, horror at what happened, relief that I'm okay, and a lingering sadness for what I had to do to protect myself. But honestly, if I hadn't done it, I might not be here to tell the story. So, I don't feel guilty. I just feel grateful I survived and did what I had to. I'll never forget that night. It was about 7 years ago, and I was heading home after a long day, looking forward to finally relaxing. I'd just changed lanes when a car came up fast behind me, almost grazing my bumper. I looked in my rearview mirror and could see the driver was visibly angry, gesturing at me, shouting something I couldn't hear. I tried to ignore it and keep my eyes on the road, but he sped up, pulling up alongside me, then swerved to cut me off, forcing me to brake hard. I felt my heart rate spike, the adrenaline surging. I was nervous, but tried to rationalize that maybe he'd just had a bad day, or maybe he was just an aggressive driver with no real harm intended. But as I looked over at him, his face was twisted with rage. Then he jumped out of his car. He was stumbling, clearly intoxicated, and in his hand, glinting under the streetlight, was a knife. My stomach dropped as he staggered toward my car. I reached for my glove compartment where I kept my firearm. I'd trained for years and knew I was within my rights to defend myself, but that didn't make it any easier. He reached my window, pounding on it and yelling slurred threats. Then he started to swing the knife, slashing wildly, and at that moment, every ounce of self-preservation kicked in. I opened the door, gun in hand, pointed at him, trying to convey that I wasn't a target he wanted to mess with. The look in his eyes shifted momentarily to something that resembled fear. I remember feeling my finger on the trigger, knowing that, according to all logic and legal grounds, I'd be justified in pulling it if he lunged again. But I just couldn't do it. Something in me froze. Instead, I watched as he muttered something incomprehensible, retreated back to his car, and peeled out. I thought it was over. But then, to my horror, I saw him turn his car around and aim right for me. He was driving straight at me, and I barely managed to jump out of the way. As I scrambled, I memorized his license plate, clutching onto that detail as if it would be my lifeline. The police arrived shortly after. I gave them every detail I could, heart still pounding from the encounter. The officer was surprisingly calm as he listened, then told me something I've replayed in my mind ever since. If you'd fired, it would have been justified. He said it without judgment, just a statement of fact, but it struck deep. I had hesitated when my life was on the line. In that moment, my mind had overridden my instincts. To this day, I sometimes wonder what might have happened if he'd managed to stab me or if he'd succeeded in hitting me with his car. But I also feel an odd sense of relief that I didn't pull the trigger. It's a strange thing, feeling both empowered and vulnerable in a single moment. I'm just grateful I walked away with a story and not a tragedy. I still remember that night like it was yesterday, even though I'd rather forget it. My friend, let's call him Alex, had been going through a rough patch, relationship problems, work stress, and a few other things piling up. He'd been pretty open about his struggles, but that night, something had clearly snapped. He showed up at my place, visibly shaken. I could tell right away something was wrong. I barely had time to process his expression before he lunged at me, a kitchen knife clutched in his hand. In that split second, every instinct in me kicked into overdrive. I wasn't thinking, just reacting. I managed to grab his arm and twist him down to the floor. We struggled for what felt like hours, but it was probably just a few minutes. My mind was on survival mode, fully aware that the slightest slip could end badly. As I held him down, the front door burst open and his sister appeared. Her reaction was as expected. Sheer horror at seeing her brother pinned down by me, with me shouting for her to call the police. She had no idea what was happening. To her, I was just the guy holding her brother down. She started screaming at me, calling me all kinds of names. She didn't know the context, didn't see the knife still clutched in his hand, and I was terrified she might do something impulsive. But thankfully, in the end, she saw enough to understand and called the cops. It was hard enough restraining him, but trying to stay calm and not lash out at her only made things worse. Her screams made Alex angrier. He kept struggling and shouting things I couldn't quite make out. I was terrified that his sister might do something impulsive and make the whole situation spiral out of control. In the end, the police arrived before that happened. After they separated us and got Alex the help he needed, I expected a wave of relief to hit me, but it never came. Instead, it felt surreal, like I'd just gone through some nightmare scenario. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. And when his sister finally realized the full story, I think she wanted to apologize, but didn't know how to start. There was no closure for any of us. Later, I tried reaching out to Alex to talk about it, but he didn't really seem to remember the incident in the same way. He knew he'd had some kind of breakdown, but couldn't grasp the gravity of what had happened. We couldn't really talk about it, like it was some taboo memory. The worst part is, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been able to hold him down, or if his sister had gotten involved physically. It's the kind of thing that sits in the back of your mind, a reminder of how unpredictable life can be. Every time I think back to that night, there's this haunting thought of what if. It was pure adrenaline that got me through, but the emotional aftermath has stayed far longer than the initial shock. So this happened a few years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was about 14 at the time, and I was home alone for the evening because my parents went out to dinner with some friends. It was a pretty normal night, honestly. I had some pizza, threw on some YouTube videos, and eventually started playing one of my favorite games. Pretty sure it was Minecraft or Fortnite, one of those. I had my headphones on and was really into it when I heard this weird sound. Like, at first, I thought it was in the game, maybe some random sound effect or something. But when I paused, it was still there. It was kind of muffled, like people whispering. It wasn't coming from inside the house, though, which gave me a small bit of relief. It sounded like it was coming from the backyard. Now, my backyard is pretty average. Some grass, a deck, a couple of trees. But it's fenced in with a 6-foot privacy fence. Nobody's supposed to be back there unless you come through the house or somehow climb over. So, obviously, hearing voices back there immediately freaked me out. I walked over to the back door, but I didn't want to just throw it open and be like, "Hey, what's going on?" Because, I'm not that stupid. There's this small window next to the door that's perfect for peeking outside without being seen. I stood on my tiptoes and looked out, and that's when I saw them. 3 guys, all wearing ski masks, standing in a little huddle by the shed. At first, I thought, this has to be some kind of prank, right? But then I noticed how serious they looked, whispering to each other and pointing at the house. One of them was even holding some kind of tool, like a crowbar or something. That's when it hit me. They weren't just hanging out in my backyard. They had definitely broken in. I froze for a second, because I wasn't sure what to do. My heart was pounding like crazy, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I knew I couldn't just ignore it, though, so I grabbed my phone and called 911 as quietly as possible. The operator was super calm, which helped me not completely lose it. She told me to stay on the line and stay hidden, so I crouched down next to the door and kept peeking out the window every few seconds to see what they were doing. They were still there when I started hearing the faint sound of police sirens in the distance. I thought, okay, maybe this is gonna end soon. But then, one of the guys suddenly stopped talking and cocked his head like he heard the sirens too. He said something to the others, and they all bolted toward the fence. I couldn't believe how fast they climbed over. It was like watching some kind of parkour video. By the time the police arrived, the guys were long gone. The officers checked out the backyard and around the house, but they didn't find much. No real damage, no sign they had actually tried to break into the house yet. They said it was lucky I saw them when I did and called right away. They took my statement and said they'd keep an eye out. But honestly, I don't think they ever caught those guys. No updates, no arrests, nothing. For weeks after that, I was on edge every time I was home alone. I kept all the doors and windows locked, triple-checked every time I heard the tiniest noise, and even slept with a baseball bat next to my bed. It took a long time to feel normal again. So, yeah, that's my creepy backyard story. I'm just glad I noticed them before anything worse happened. It still messes with me sometimes, though, especially when I think about how close they were to getting into the house. Like, what if I hadn't heard them? Last summer, my wife Emily and I decided to rent this little cabin out in the woods for a quiet getaway. We both work stressful jobs and thought a week in the middle of nowhere would be just what we needed to unwind. The cabin was super remote, like no cell service unless you walked up the hill behind the property. It was charming in a rustic way, with a big fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and lots of windows looking out into the forest. The first couple of days were amazing. We went hiking, cooked together, played board games, and just soaked in the peace and quiet. By the third night, we were completely relaxed and went to bed early. It was so quiet outside, you could hear every little rustle of leaves or distant animal sounds, but it was comforting in a weird way. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to this faint noise. It wasn't like the wind or an animal. It sounded more deliberate, like footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. At first I thought maybe I imagined it, but then it happened again. I lay there for a minute, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but Emily stirred next to me and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I told her to stay in bed while I checked it out. She wasn't thrilled about that plan and grabbed my arm like she wanted to stop me, but I told her it was probably just a raccoon or something. Honestly, I didn't fully believe that myself, but I didn't want to freak her out. So, I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and headed toward the window by the front door. I could feel my heart pounding as I reached for the curtain. I don't know what I expected to see, but it wasn't this. When I pulled back the curtain, there was a man standing just behind the window glass, staring straight at me. He wasn't wearing a mask or anything, just had this blank expression, like he wasn't scared to be seen. His scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his face made him look almost ordinary, but he was so still, it felt like he'd been standing there forever. I screamed, like actually screamed, and stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight. Emily was out of bed in an instant, asking what happened, but I couldn't even get the words out right away. I just pointed at the window, but by the time she came over and looked, the guy was gone. We double-checked all the doors and window locks before calling the police. It took about an hour for them to get there because the cabin was so remote. By the time they arrived, We were both a nervous wreck. The officers were polite, but didn't seem overly concerned. They walked around the property with flashlights, scanning the tree line and checking the area, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. They told us it was probably just some local messing around or maybe a hiker who got lost. That didn't make me feel any better. If someone was lost, why were they just standing there, staring into the cabin like that? And how did they disappear so quickly? We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every little sound outside made us jump. By morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head home. The whole drive back, Emily kept saying, "What if he comes back? What if he was watching us the whole time?" We never got any answers. The rental company refunded us for the remaining days, and they said they hadn't had any similar complaints before. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whoever that was, they weren't just messing around. Sometimes I lie awake at night wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up, or worse, if I'd opened the door. I still can't shake this off. It happened just a couple of months ago, and every time I think about it, I feel a cold chill run down my spine. I live alone in a small apartment building. It's not the fanciest place, just a basic one-bedroom, but I like it well enough. My neighbors are mostly quiet, and everything was normal that night until it wasn't. I was in the kitchen making dinner, my hands covered in dough because I was kneading bread. That's when I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't super loud, but in my quiet apartment, it felt sharp, sudden. I called out, "Just a second," and quickly rinsed my hands. By the time I got to the door and opened it, no one was there. I looked up and down the hallway, feeling a little annoyed and a lot confused. It didn't make sense. There's no way someone could have knocked and disappeared that fast. Shrugging it off, I closed the door and went back to my cooking. Maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, I heard screaming. It was coming from next door, muffled but loud enough to send my heart racing. My neighbor's apartment is right up against mine, and the walls are paper thin. I could hear things crashing, like someone was throwing furniture, and more screaming, a woman's voice. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my phone and called the police. The operator asked if I'd seen anything, but I hadn't. It was all sound. While waiting for the cops, I stayed by my door, heart pounding, listening to the chaos next door. It all went quiet a few minutes before the police arrived. When they got there, I went outside to meet them. That's when I saw it. My neighbor's door was open just a little, but enough to make my stomach turn. I followed the officers inside and instantly wished I hadn't. She was there, my neighbor, lying on the floor, not moving. There was blood everywhere, and the whole place looked like a tornado had hit it. I felt like I was going to throw up. The officers told me to wait outside, and I sat on the hallway floor, shaking as they started investigating. A little while later, one of the officers told me they'd checked the building's CCTV cameras. They pulled me into their car to show me what they found. My stomach dropped when I saw the footage. It showed a man, completely disheveled, stumbling into the building with a knife in his hand. He came up to my floor and knocked on my door. I watched as I didn't answer right away, too busy in the kitchen, and the man waited, pacing. But then, my neighbor's door opened. She had stepped out, probably to take her garbage to the chute. The second he saw her, he lunged. She screamed, and he shoved her back into her apartment. That was it. The footage didn't show what happened inside. but it was enough. I couldn't breathe. If I'd answered my door faster, that could have been me. They caught him a few days later. Apparently, he had a history of drug problems and random violent outbursts. The police told me he was high out of his mind when he entered our building and had no real plan. Just picked a random place and decided to target whoever opened their door first. But knowing he was caught didn't make it any easier. For days after, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the knock on my door, imagining what would have happened if I hadn't been busy with the dough. I ended up moving out a month later. It just didn't feel like home anymore, and honestly, I couldn't stay there without remembering what happened. I still think about my neighbor sometimes, how random it all was, and how close I came to being in her place. When I moved into my new house, I was excited. It was a big, old place with a lot of character, perfect for me to settle into. The neighborhood seemed quiet, and I was looking forward to making it my home. But soon after moving in, I started hearing strange noises at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old houses often do. But as the nights went on, the noises got weirder. It started with cabinets opening and closing, not just one or two times, but like someone was rummaging through them. Then came muffled sounds, like footsteps or whispers, but no one was ever there when I checked. I told myself it was just the house. I didn't want to believe anything else. But the longer it went on, the more uneasy I became. Things started going missing. Small things at first, some snacks, a bottle of water, a few cans of soup from the pantry. I figured maybe I was just being forgetful, or that I'd misplaced things. But as time passed, it happened more frequently. My supplies would disappear, and I'd find the kitchen a mess, like someone had been inside while I wasn't looking. I had no pets, no one else living with me, and no explanation. One night, after hearing a strange noise that sounded like a door opening, I decided to thoroughly investigate the house, starting from the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there before, aside from storing some boxes and old furniture. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I felt a sudden chill in the air. Something about the space felt off. As I looked around, I noticed something strange. There was a small door hidden behind some old furniture in the back corner. I'd never seen it before, and I couldn't figure out why it was there. It didn't seem to belong to any part of the house I knew. When I opened it, my heart stopped. Inside was a small, makeshift living space, clothes, trash, and even a bed made from old blankets and pillows. It looked like someone had been living there, and it wasn't just some drifter or squatter. There was a rusty axe lying on the floor, along with other disturbing signs that this person had been there for a while. I felt sick to my stomach. I immediately called the police, who arrived not long after. They searched the entire house and found that the basement window was unlocked, which was how the intruder had likely been coming and going. They said it seemed like the person had been living there for weeks, maybe even months, using the basement as a secret hideout. The police told me they'd keep an eye on the area, but the whole experience left me completely unsettled. It was clear the intruder had been watching me for some time, taking food and supplies without me noticing. I couldn't stay there any longer. The idea of someone having lived in my basement, hiding in the shadows and sneaking around while I slept, was too much to bear. I decided to leave the house and began making plans to move out permanently. Even now, months later, the thought of it makes me shudder. I can't help but wonder how close I came to something far worse. I don't know who was living down there, and I never want to know. All I know is that the house once full of promise, became a place of nightmares. When my dad fell sick, I was desperate to find help. His condition was bad enough that he needed round-the-clock care, and I couldn't do it alone. That's when I hired a live-in doctor, a decision I'd later regret more than anything. At first, the doctor seemed perfect. He was polite, professional, and genuinely seemed to care about my dad. He worked tirelessly, keeping my dad comfortable and helping with medications. For a while, I thought I'd found a blessing in the middle of a nightmare. But it wasn't long before things started to feel off. It began with the way he looked at me. Too long, too intense. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe I was imagining it, I thought. Then he started making comments that felt inappropriate, like complimenting my clothes in a way that felt more personal than professional. I told myself I was being paranoid, but his behavior kept escalating. He started showing up wherever I was in the house, even when it didn't make sense. If I was in the kitchen, he'd appear suddenly, asking unnecessary questions. If I was in the living room, he'd stand in the doorway, just watching. I'd catch him staring at me in ways that made my skin crawl. Then, one day, he crossed a line I couldn't ignore. He came to me with an offer, one so disgusting and degrading that I felt sick to my stomach. He told me that if I couldn't afford my dad's medical payments, he could take care of it in exchange for certain favors. I felt trapped. My dad needed him, and I didn't have the money to pay anyone else. I avoided him as much as I could after that, locking my door every night and making sure I was never alone with him. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door handle rattling. My heart stopped. Someone was trying to get in. I held my breath, frozen, as the handle jiggled harder. Then I heard his voice, low and muttering, from the other side of the door. It was the doctor. I grabbed my phone and called the police, whispering into the receiver while he continued to try the door. Thankfully, I'd locked it, and after a few minutes, he gave up and fled. I stayed on the line with the cops until they arrived, but by then, he was gone. They searched the house and found his things missing. He'd packed up and disappeared. For the next few days, I was a wreck, jumping at every sound and barely sleeping. My dad's condition got worse, and with no one to help, I could only do so much. The doctor was caught a week later, in another state. It turned out he had a history of predatory behavior and had been reported for similar incidents before, but somehow he always managed to move on before facing real consequences. By the time he was caught, it was too late for my dad. He passed away shortly after. Losing him was devastating, and knowing that the man I'd trusted to help him was a predator made it so much worse. I still feel guilt for bringing that doctor into our lives, even though I know I couldn't have predicted how things would turn out. But what scares me the most is how close I came to opening that door that night. If I hadn't locked it, I don't even want to think about what might have happened. It's been months now, and I've moved away, trying to rebuild my life. But the memory of that doctor, his voice outside my door, his disgusting offers, still haunts me. I trusted him with my dad's life and our safety, and he betrayed that trust in the worst way possible.